So Char has spoken with our group before. I think this may be the third time, and every time we think we've seen the last of him, he writes another book. So I'm going to
Every
read
time
you.
you wished you saw the last
No,
of him.
no, 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 no,
Yeah.
no, no. I'm going to read you his bio that's online, and then bring it up to date. Char's teaching and research reflect his fascination with all things environmental. Classes on U.S. environmental history, water in the U.S. West, and public lands management, like those on urbanization and the interplay between the natural and built landscapes, have deeply informed his writing. And he's a professor at Pomona's environmental analysis and history programs and teaches a environmental analysis major um, at Pomona College. He received the Distinguished Alumni Award from Pomfret School at his 50th reunion in 2020. In 2015, he was awarded the Pomona Alumni Office's Distinguished Service Award. 2 years earlier, he was named a Whig Distinguished Professor at Pomona College for teaching excellence. Um, he's written a number of books, and the last one I believe that he talked to us about was a collection of essays called "Natural Consequences: Intimate Essays for a Planet in Peril." That was published in 2022. Um, and he's written about you know floods. He's written about Hetchetchee and the history involved with Hetchetchee. He's written about Theodore Roosevelt um, and forestry topics. He's written about the Ogallala Aquifer. My gosh, that's a 38th parallel story out there in Kansas and that part of the world. Lots of things, very, very widely published. He's a fellow of the senior fellow of the Pinchot Institute for Conservation, a fellow of the Texas State Historical Association and the Forest History Society. And I want to read to you the where did it go here? The most recent. I have it right in front of me here. I did have it right in front of me. Where did it go? Um, his maybe it's over here. I don't know. Let me just say that about the most recent thing. What we're going to be hearing about is his most recent book or topics related to that. And it's called Burn Scars, a documentary history of fire suppression from colonial origins to the resurgence of cultural burning. And as you'll hear, and by the way, this is an edited book of an amazing amount of research that Char did, pulling together um, published material related to this topic, and fascinating to read things that I had never come across before. The cultural part of this story is big and is a major part of why he wrote this book and what he has to say about it. And pay attention to that. I'm sure Char will explain. Um, so this book came out in 2024. Hasn't been out very long. We will carry it this summer in our bookstore in the museum. It's available widely at all the usual places people can purchase books. So I suggest you do that. Um, Thank you for joining us again, Char.
Well, thank you so much, David, and that was a lovely introduction. And thank you to all the folks who are on. Ellen, it's good to see you there, and my college roommate, Carrie Bunker Livingston. How fun is that? And so, what I want to do today, and this is going to be complicated for some reason, I can't share my slide deck with the Mona Basin Society. So I'm going to be looking at my slide deck on my computer and saying, next slide, please. So forgive that little glitch, but I hope it works well. This photograph actually on the cover here is from Jill Stark, whose husband was once president of Claremont McKenna College in Claremont and lives here except in the summertime where she's up on June Lake. And she took this photograph in 2020 as the fires along the Sierra, blue smoke and this extraordinary orange color. You can see June Lake and the trees at the edge of the lake in the background if you squint really hard. She shared it with me and at that one of those moments where June Lake, like Mammoth, like Bishop and elsewhere, just were extraordinarily impacted by the fires that were erupting along the Sierra Range. And that actually is one of the moments why that's part of why this book emerged. And I want to give you a little bit of the backstory as a way to help you understand what we're going to do tonight. In August and September of 2020, five of the then six largest fires in the history of the state were burning simultaneously. We were also in a pandemic. We also had an extraordinarily bad president, and we got him again. And my students were far away. And so some of what I was working on at the time was trying to think out how to teach on Zoom and also how to engage them wherever they were in the world with what was happening in California, just as a teaching process, not because I thought they really should be paying attention necessarily to a state on fire. But to think about that was to then raise the question, well, why are we going through this? What is happening here? A question that sort of was re-energized the next summer when the same thing happened again. And in those two fire seasons of such extraordinary size and impact, I kind of conceived of a way to teach about fire that would include creating a book that helped walk us through one segment of the history of fire in the American West. That I thought was both eminently teachable, and because I'd read a lot of David Carl and Steve Pine, I knew from their own footnotes there were stories to be told if I could find the documents that I could then replicate in the book. So I started to do that and immediately ran into a kind of positionality issue, which is as a non-Indigenous writer, scholar, teacher. I wanted to convey as richly as I could the indigenous fire practices that had obviously done so much to create the state of California itself, that were then ultimately suppressed first by the Spanish and then by the US Forest Service. And I wrestled with that in part because I didn't know how to deal with the first part of this question, and the first part being the Spanish themselves and what happened, and how do you write about a set of polities, a set of peoples up and down the coast of California who were not yet literate. Oral history, certainly, but oral histories would be hard to access. And for whatever reason, I had forgotten that I'd been using a lot of Spanish colonial documentation, missionaries' writings and the like in San Antonio, where I lived for many, many years when I wrote about that city. And there was all this environmental stuff in there. I was like, oh, God, how did you forget that? So I started reading Juan Crespi and other early Spanish missionaries. And when you're looking for it, all of a sudden you realize they were writing about fire all the time. Beginning, in fact, in the 1600s, as they hove into San Diego Bay, they're stunned by the amount of columns of smoke that they saw and the amount of smoke floating over the bay. One of them called San Diego Bay the Bay of Furnaces, the Bay of Smoke, and kept seeing this kind of language, and then following the land movement of these entradas as they move their way north, they're constantly talking about fire. And I realized, okay, so here's a way that a non-Indigenous scholar can actually utilize other non-Indigenous observers' language to give us a feel for the way in which fire could be manifest on the ground. And we have some evidence for that. And indeed, the commentary of the Spanish themselves. The second half of that part of the story, and the book is framed in this way quite deliberately, is to utilize what was being written constantly by indigenous fire managers in 2020 and 2021, and The Guardian and elsewhere, Bill Tripp and people like that, I knew I wanted to have them, and I knew I also wanted to have a fire manager that I'd worked with, an indigenous fire manager from San Diego, Michael Colony Misquish, um, do a piece for the book because the story begins in San Diego if one's starting with the Spanish, and he could both write that history but also write the antidote to that history, which is his very own work. So I knew what the framing was going to be. The rest of it was and is drawn from both visitors, tourists, scientists, government officials, and the like, who help us unfold this larger story about fire in the land and how different cultural communities manage it and manage themselves in the process. So that's sort of the overview. What I'm going to do, and if I can have the next slide, please. One of the things that I want to sort of help you see is that same moment in 2020 or so when I'm starting to think about, well, what's the justification for a book like this outside of my own interest in teaching this material? And so I started digging around, and CAL FIRE has this wonderful data, and I've updated it through 2025. But one of the things that was also driving this story were threefold. The first of which is now, given what happened in Los Angeles in January, 18 of the 20 most destructive fires in this state have occurred since 2003. 19 of the 20 largest, that's by acreage, have occurred in that same time frame. 13 of the 20 most deadly occurred in between '03 and 2025. And if you wanted a second bracket or context for this, do keep in mind, as we learn every year, the planetary warming that is going on has almost inevitably since 2003 broken a new record. Not consistently, but if you drew the line between them. So the planet is warming, the fires are burning, and I'm not going to tell you that Burn Scar helps us better understand those processes, but it is a tool to get there. And it's proved to be really good at, and I'm not bragging about the book, it's the documents that really make this work. It's very good at generating the kinds of discussions that I think we need to have about fire and our place in it and with it and our accelerant force that we bring to the process of fire, whether they're urban fires, structural fires of Los Angeles, or more rural forest fires in the eastern and western slope of the Sierra. We're deeply engaged, deeply implicated, and this book is a way for us to think about at least one strand of that implication, one set of the responsibilities that we hold. So if I could get the next slide, please. So thinking about that led me to start to read various Spanish missionaries, as I mentioned, and one of many things that began to emerge is not only did the Spanish write about the world on fire that they encountered and the world of smoke that they breathed as they moved their way north up into the Bay Area from San Diego, but they also would begin to talk about why that was problematic. Not that they liked fire too, they utilized it to manage the range so that they could get new grass and they could grow cattle. What they were really interested in, obviously, is converting a people, but to convert a people meant that you also had to convert the land. And if you used fire, but you didn't like the way the other people used fire, then you had to take the fire out of their hands so that you could train them up to be the people that you would want, who would work in a certain way. In effect, what Catholicism did, what the missionaries did, was to convert the land to sedentary agriculture, to convert the indigenous people to the cultivators of that sedentary agriculture. And to do that, you had to take fire out of their hand. One of the key documents that I encountered was a proclamation that one of the provincial governors, who was also a missionary, laid down, that argued that every single missionary and the police force, the militia force that they had at their disposal, their task was basically to stop fire being used by other people, not by Spanish ranchers, but by the indigenous people of California, wherever they may have been. And the key to that was to understand, as Father Lausanne did, that there was this dynamic, and you may have to squint to read what he has to say. I don't want to read it for you, but I think one of the ways to think about is to think about the language that he deploys, about what he's doing and what he thinks about the people that he wants to convert. The soil is uncultivated, and so are the people. That they are not, in his language, civilized, but the fact that they can survive on their own, that they can utilize natural resources and have no need for the plow or any other tool that Westerners might have brought in, was problematic if you're a missionary, because your whole goal is to convert, to transform the people, and in the process, in this case, to transform the land. And one of the ways that really, the moment I saw this quote, that really encapsulated for me as an environmental historian, but also a human being, was the way in which Lausanne makes the case brilliantly from his own perspective that the only way to turn indigenous people into human, Christian, civil, and industrious was to denaturalize them. Read that again, to denaturalize them, to uproot them literally as well as metaphorically. And so even as you built, and this was the now damaged, now ruins of the mission, even as you conceived of agriculture being both plow-based and cattle raising, or sheep and goat, depending on where you were, you needed to transform the people from the ground up. And you had to strip away from them the capacity to feed themselves so that they would feed you. It's a remarkable and I think really telling comment. The Spanish found themselves to be in a particularly weird position in some senses, that their success meant destroying the communities that they were seeking to convert. But from their vantage point, and again, this quote helps us understand this, there was no compromise that was possible, both agriculturally and humanly, other than to do what they did. And so part of the story then is that when we think about fire suppression, and we sort of think about the Forest Service as the agent of that, in effect, the Forest Service is simply doing at a broader scale and in a grander and perhaps more effective way, we'll see in a moment, what the Spanish had been doing 200 years earlier. So 200, maybe 150 years earlier. And for both the agency of missionaries and the agency of foresters, there was the notion that anyone who used fire to manage the landscape and to do so in a way that ran counter to what you thought they should be doing, was savage, was outside the pale of, or in the pale, outside the pale of conversation and civilization. And so it's a really profoundly important moment when the Spanish missionaries, to a person, make these same claims, whether they're in San Diego or Los Angeles or Santa Barbara or all the way up into Monterey, and up into the Bay Area, that you were seeing the unfolding of one civilization dedicated to the suppression of fire as a tool of that civilization, taking control of this landscape. Could I have the next slide, please? What that then sets up, and there's sort of a prelude before this quote and the others that we'll see, which is I also look at 19th century American conversations before the Forest Service became the Forest Service around fire. And it's a really interesting mixed bag of commentary. Lots of people thought that fire was bad, and early agency heads in Washington, D.C., and the Forest Service didn't really exist, but there were foresters or those who were thought to be such, who believed that forest fires were bad. And then there were all of these other people, and this is an important part of the story. There were all of these other people who were working as ranchers, as miners, as loggers in the Sierra and the Rockies and elsewhere, who understood what the Spanish also didn't like, which is that fire and some tree species were actually woven together, that you could not. Longleaf pine in the south, as we will see in a little bit, was one of these species that actually requires fire to regenerate. So there was part of what I was really interested in is like, was there a counter protest before there was even a Forest Service conception of fire suppression? And in fact, there is. They're everywhere. Sometimes it's in state agencies or federal agencies. Sometimes it's just economic actors who fully understood, appreciated, as we will see in a moment, that there was a counter language. And so part of what I was really interested in when we start to shift into the 19 teens and such is that the paradigm that will begin to emerge, and most vocally in the early 1920s, that no fire is good fire, all fire must be suppressed anywhere at any time, actually bore the seeds of its own destruction at the same moment it was being born. That there were counter protests, counter narratives written by people just as smart as the others who might at some point in the 1920s take a Model T, put some wheels on it, roll it down rail lines so that they could fight fire and be much more mobile. It's a remarkable technology that the Fire Forest Service was inventing on the fly, that it felt it needed to invent because it was committed to doing something that ultimately would prove almost impossible for them to achieve. But I want to set up then in the teens and 20s this dynamic between those who believed suppression was essential and why they felt it was essential, and those who countered that argument and why they developed that counter argument. So here's Henry Graves, the second chief of the U.S. Forest Service in 1920. The Forest Service was really, really good at getting its voice heard. Although Leopold, Graves, William B. Greeley, who would be the third chief in 1920, were all publishing arguments in favor of fire suppression and opposed to those who believed that fire had some virtue to it. In the Graves argument here, timber that the sort of what they called virgin timber that is as yet uncut, we're in the first generation of it, is going to be depleted. The Forest Service now must oppose, and note the language, with utmost vigor, any system of protection which would wreck this growing forest and make it impossible to reproduce timber for an economy that was very wood-centered in 1920. This was crucial in the Western Pine Belt, he says. It was no less true in the South, or so they thought. They would be proven wrong by that. But the goal here from Graves's point of view is technology is a tool to get us to an end that we need, which is to suppress fire as fully and as vigorously as we possibly can. Could I have the next slide, please? Joseph Kitts, on the other hand, was one of many writers, ranchers and the like, who were publishing in timber magazines and in local newspapers. And, you know, here I'm sitting in the midst of the pandemic in my office going, how am I going to do this? I don't have access to stuff. But it turns out digitizing ramped up during the pandemic and in the 5 years in advance of that. And you can find a hell of a lot of material if you start digging long enough. And I had a lot of hours. So I spent a lot of time doing this. And Joseph Kitts is one of the people that I stumbled upon, in part because I just happened to be flipping through what's called the Timberman, which was where this article first appeared, a journal I didn't know existed. And there he is talking about the work that he was doing and what he believed to be its source. Indians practiced periodic practice. Burning over the forest is well known. In other words, indigenous people used the surface fire often enough to prevent the litter from accumulating into crown fire proportions, have small fires, not large fires. They may not have had a scientific vantage point that foresters would accept in 1919. But as he says, their methods of preservation and natural reproduction, meaning that fire was essential to the reproduction of the tree itself, the species itself, is a lot more successful than what the Forest Service was pursuing. And so on the left, the photograph is a forest inspector in the Sierra using whatever he can to put out a small fire in the forests. But note the technology. The Forest Service can claim that it will put out fires. It doesn't have the technology and it does not have the personnel yet to do the work that it is promising it will be able to do. We'll get to that in a moment, but I just wanted you to see this. This is a Forest Inspector Jardine, which is also used in a fabulous book that Hal Rothman did, the late Hal Rothman did many years ago. I'll Never Fight Fire with My Bare Hands Again was the title, which is one of the Forest Service employees had sworn he would never do again. And they used this particular photograph to sort of underscore that they were using every tool at their disposal, including their hands, to get to the ends that they wanted. But that's going to be really hard. What Kitts is helping us understand is that a logger, and he was a logger, understood both the historic use of fire by indigenous people in and around the Klamath area, which is where he lived and logged, and in the Sierra. And that there was a history there that was passed on through oral histories, traditions, that he would had access to. And that in a way, he was using that oral history to counteract the professionalizing language of silviculture that the Forest Service would practice and preach for many years since. If I could have the next slide, please. There we go. Great. So, given that LA seemed and was on fire this past January, and in truth, go back to 2003, and virtually every fire season has been pretty epic. I was really interested in the 1924 fire, the San Gabriel fire. They didn't bear names then, but we're now calling it that because it happened in San Gabriel Valley in the canyon and then erupted across the range. It was a huge fire, 50, 60,000 acres, not unlike the bridge fire that burned north of Claremont, where I live this spring, essentially the same size, had the same kind of pyrocumulus clouds that were mushrooming up into the sky. We were fortunate that the wind blew north and not south, because otherwise the sort of Altadena effect might well have happened in Claremont and in Upland, the two towns that sort of front this part of the San Gabriel Mountains. Two things happened with that fire. One of which is that William B. Greeley, who was then chief, the third chief of the Forest Service, hopped on a train from Washington and raced out to Los Angeles, as he did periodically in the 1920s, because the San Gabriel Mountains had huge fires in those years. And the moment he got off the train station, out of the train station, he immediately went to the fire lines, because he had fought the 1910 fires up in Missoula and in Idaho. So he thought he understood fire. And maybe he did under those conditions. The San Gabriels are a very different beast. But he would get to the fire lines, he would go up to the fire lines, and he would start telling the fire bosses, the folks who had actually fought fires in Southern California, what they should do. When the forest supervisor of the Angeles National Forest said, gently, trust us, we know what we're doing, he immediately fired him on the spot. That's called micromanaging. And Greeley was a micromanager in many respects. But what's interesting, in addition to that, and revelatory about Greeley's arguments, because he is going to be one of the most important, vociferous, and vigorous opponents of what he called, quote, Paiute forestry, was that some of those Paiutes, although they weren't Paiutes, they were mission Indians in Southern California. Indigenous folks who lived in Southern California, looking at these fires blow up in the 1920s, wrote a letter to Calvin Coolidge and said in the letter, and this is taken from a National Forest district newsletter, they wrote to Coolidge suggesting that the Forest Service couldn't manage the San Gabriels that they had managed for millennia. So maybe it was time for the Forest Service and the federal government to turn the land back to the Mission Indians and the Tongva and the Chumash people who had managed them quite well, thank you, back in the day where there were no such fires such as this. And the USDA response was, because obviously Coolidge passed this on to the Forest Service and asked them to respond, was in the language of a kind of settler state saying, essentially, thanks so much for your letter. If you were properly trained, we could use you. But that training would be, of course, to suppress fires, not to manage with prescribed fire, with controlled burns, as Indigenous people all over Southern California, in fact, all over the state, had managed these landscapes. The Spanish were right about that. The Forest Service denied it. But it's a fascinating moment that in 24, Indigenous voices, not just lumber and range managers, white range managers, were also looking at what was going on and were able to figure out politically how to get their voice heard, even though it would ultimately be dismissed. Could I have the next slide, please? The agency and the federal government didn't just dismiss Indigenous understandings of fire, they doubled down. And by the 1930s, the agency, even though, as I mentioned earlier, does not have the capacity yet, technically or in personnel ways, to actually do what they're about to say, argued that the key to understanding national defense, but 7 years, 6 years earlier, the agency had been doubling down on its commitment so that in a agency-wide notification that then would go out to the profession later in the 30s, the agency here commits itself to doing what is called the 10 a.m. rule. If you discover a forest fire on day one, the goal must be that it would be extinguished on day two by 10 a.m. And if you didn't do that, if you weren't able to gain control, as this text tells us, then every day, every succeeding day, as it says, without reservation, you must obtain control. That must be the goal. Everything that you do must be towards that goal. Well, that tends to get a little what's the word for it? A little stressing. Because what it essentially says is you've got one task, and your task is to put the fire out, notwithstanding, in the case of Southern California and the Santa Ana winds, regardless of what is happening in the air, regardless of the speed with which this fire is moving, regardless whether the humidity is low and the temperature is high, you need to throw bodies against that fire at any time and anywhere. It's not going to be possible again, as I've mentioned, but it does tell you the degree to which the rhetoric was in fact getting ramped up. And that becomes problematic because at some point the agency is actually going to get the tools, they're going to get the capacity to do the work that it really had wanted to do in 1910, 1920. But it's really going to take time, and that's going to be, if I could have the next slide. It's going to continue up until about the 1940s and 50s when they get it. But the other piece of this book is going back and looking at ways in which the arguments about fire were constantly being counteracted in different parts of the country by different people. And I want to start this part of the counteract. The section is called Southern Backfire, as a way to help us understand that even as they're putting pressure on within the agency to shut down fires everywhere, there was this growing set of opinions, and the South was one of the places where white scientists, white woodcraft folks, people who had lived in forests for generations, were beginning to come together and argue that at least in the South, and there was a sort of regional focus, that what pertains elsewhere, if it pertained elsewhere, didn't hold true in this region. Ellen Call Long, who was the daughter of a territorial governor of Florida and would marry a subsequent territorial governor of Florida before it became a state, and then, excuse me, a state governor. In 1888 was the only woman who gave a presentation at the North American Forest Congress of that year. And her piece is really interesting, and I've kept a lot of it in the text, mostly because of both the way she writes and the way in which she wrestles with the problem that nobody else at that particular convention wrestled with, which is statute books say one thing. The reality on the ground is something else. As she said, there may be sound reason for such legislation to snuff out all fire. But viewed from a forestry standpoint, she is arguing, not as a forester, though she's using that language, viewed from this standpoint, if we abolish fire in the South, we will annihilate the grand timber lumbering pineries, which were mostly longleaf pine. She knew, because she had lived in Florida her entire life, had watched both indigenous Floridians and others who were managing with fire, that they understood the science, the botany of this. They understood the biology of this process in ways that foresters would not concede. If I could have the next slide, please. Her insights will continue to shape the dialogue for the next 50 years or so. S.W. Green, who also worked for the USDA, but for one of its sub-agencies, wrote a piece called The Fire That Forest Made in 1933. It's a brilliant analysis of fire in southern landscapes and the degree to which, as he says in here, that forest owners have a clear understanding in ways that the federal government does not, that fire was and should be used as a controlled burning device, because fire was not a master but a servant. But Green's talk at the Society of American Foresters, that will then be published in American Forests, which was another forestry magazine, was perceived to be so provocative that the editor of the journal, in his own note at the beginning of the issue of the journal, didn't castigate this, but it set it in the context in which, we're publishing it, but we're not really, we don't think this thing makes any sense, and we don't want to tick off the Forest Service and the like. And then at the front of the article, as in an editor's note, basically counteracts the article so that when you read that issue of the journal, and this is not the only time this happened, to this for Green, it was the first time and only time, but there were other foresters who were making similar claims to which this happened too. What they basically wanted to do, and ultimately felt that they had to publish it, but they didn't want people reading it the way it was written. They wanted people to read it through the lens of the critique before they actually got to the original document. And so I reproduced the article as much as I could without sort of blowing up the text of the book, so that readers can see what the editor was trying to do, at the same time what Green is trying to argue, so that you could see that point counterpoint right there in that particular issue in 1933. Green becomes one of the, he was reviled among Forest Service employees, although there were enough folks inside the agency who thought he was right, but it was, we will see in a second, would never say so publicly. But what Green helps to do is to coalesce the Southern pro-fire, let's call it that, pro-fire or fire reform movement that would then get at the same time another factor, another body, another voice, Herbert Stoddard, who worked for the U.S. Biological Survey and began to recognize that the disappearing quail populations of the South were disappearing because so much wiregrass and other litter was building up because there had been no fire for so long in the South that the absolutely most essential thing he could do, and he was writing in the same time as Green, is to light a match. Here he is later with a drip line that he was burning in the late 40s or so. He becomes one of the key factors to the restoration of the quail and longleaf pine forests in the South, in the same way that Green was arguing that fire was so essential to that same species for different reasons. And Stoddard will help with a bunch of other Southern fire managers, creating a thing called the Tall Timbers Organization outside Tallahassee in Florida that would become its own accelerator for these arguments in ways that are really quite fascinating, and I think makes for a really interesting sort of intellectual history of this process. Could I have the next slide, please? And so here's one of these figures who, even in 1940, firefighter for the Forest Service and a ranger, wrote to Gifford Pinchot and basically says, as you can see in the second paragraph, I know a fellow could probably be shot if he advocated this, that is to say that fire was a natural force and an absolutely essential one. But you know, nature is a pretty wise old girl, and when man tries to improve on it, we generally get things unbalanced. There were folks inside the agency who fully understood what it had done and what it shouldn't be doing, but there was such a kind of coercion internal to the organization that much of that did not bubble up for another 20 to 30 years. Could I have the next slide, please? So the key, in some ways, the Southern backfire story, as it slowly migrated to California, was one part of this process. But the real key ultimately is going to be, as the book lays it out, the forceful return of indigenous fire managers that in and of itself, I think is really interesting. And I've got two particular pieces here for us to keep in mind. But one of the things that was so striking to me in 2020 as I was reading Bill Tripp, remarkable fire manager and also writer who wrote a couple of essays for The Guardian during that fire season, Don Blake, who you'll see in a second, and a host of others, is that when they talk about how they came to understand the role of fire, they all said that it was a mother, a grandmother, a grandfather, a father, an aunt, an uncle, an oral history, in short, that was passed down from one generation to the next. So even though there's this paradigm that the Forest Service argued for fire suppression and in favor of it, that thought it had wiped out opposing points of view, there were these oral histories that in the Karuk and the Yoruk and the Hupa and others in California, in the Tongva, in the Kumeyaay, where Michael Misquish is a fire manager, they all knew the history of fire suppression. They all knew the oral histories that they had learned from one relative or another, an elder in the community. That story may have they may not have been able to use fire as much as they once did, but they didn't lose the technologies and they didn't lose the commitment. And so here we have Tripp talking in 2020 in The Guardian, in which he is talking about the sovereignty that comes from burning, that the indigenous rights to burn and tribal sovereignty are integrated. They are one thing. And overcoming that and the structural racism embedded in that has become a multi-generational task. His mother, his grandmother, his great-grandmother, they all burned. They burned for hazel. They burned for other tools that they would make baskets and the like with. And they taught him how to burn. and he is now a celebrated fire manager in Northern California. But he comes with a deep knowledge that is based on traditional ecological knowledge, is what we might call it. For him, it is just their practice. Could I have the next slide, please? Don Blake, who's a member of the Hoopa Valley and also is the fire manager, the tribal forester for the Yurok people, in a piece in the Reading newspaper in Northern California, talks about the use of this process of using fire, cultural fires, as she calls it, good fires, as Michael Misquish calls them, because this is how the landscape originally was shaped, and fire is necessary to its shaping, and that shaping is essential to pursuing the cultural, spiritual, and material goods and needs of the communities that used fire in such a remarkable way for millennia. And so the book opens with one fire manager and closes with a series of others, and also has some of California's most recent fire codes that are clearly a reaction to and a response to, really, what had been done in California beginning in the 1850s to outlaw indigenous use of fire, and even earlier that through the Spanish mission era. So part of what we've got is a story of resurgence, of recovery, of resilience. We also have a story in which those three R's are posed against the sort of racializing of the landscape and the disdain with which, for Spanish missionaries and foresters and the like, held the indigenous people of California and all over the West, because this story isn't just California. It just seems like it is most times. And in a way, for this book to work, and I hope it does, it also has to ignite a kind of conversation among those of us who are not indigenous about acknowledging the roots of this process and of this story, and also seeing that it is grassroots folks from the South, from the West, from the East, indeed, non-indigenous people, scientists and the like, who would ultimately come to understand what was understandable in the late 19th century, that fire was an essential part of managing this broader landscape. And if nothing else, it gives us a sense for how social change can come about, and why cultural burns now become a method, a process, and a promise for the indigenous Californians and those across the West. Could I have the next slide, please? So let me end it there. I'd love to take some questions about this process. I would love to urge those of you who are on this call to join us for the 10th Eastern Sierra History Conference this year, October 31 through November 2nd. I presented about burn scars at the time. We read through some of these documents as a really interesting exercise, but it's been a really profoundly important role for me to play, helping to co-organize that history conference. And indeed, in the process of doing that, this book also owes some of its creation. So thank you.
Thank you, Char. That was a great talk. We can now open it up. I see Dave Carl's clapping you. We can also open it up for questions from anybody in the audience, please.
It was so convincing. There's no questions.
So Dewey is in the chat saying that the Spanish government banned indigenous people's use of traditional fire practices in California. Is there any record of those rules being defied by any tribes, of enforcement and any punishment meted out?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dewey. There is, and this is where both one has to dig more deeply into the individual missions records, which I did not do. Although there's clearly some reference to, and I don't have the text with me, so I can't read it to you. But the proclamations make it clear that the military forces and the presidios, the military that are assigned to protect the missionaries, it was their job as well as the other missionaries' job to haul those who were using fire before before the missionaries for their punishment. It was true in South Texas, most definitely, because I do have some of those records in which the punishments were meted out as a consequence of utilizing fire for ritual practices, especially which the missionaries in South Texas really despised. The other way to think about some of this, and it's a really interesting, and I've got some of it in the book, talk about it in the introduction, is that one of the ways in which the missionaries lost control was simply by running away of indigenous converts, in part because of oppression, in part because women were being raped and children were being separated from their parents. I mean, all sorts of things were problematic. But archaeologists have sort of gone up in the canyons above Santa Barbara and have found sites that were looking down those canyons and clearly were sites of indigenous habitation that they presume, and I think it's a reasonable presumption, were runaway communities, and there they were burning, which seems counterintuitive because that's the last thing you want is a column of smoke going up because the Spanish will find you. But apparently that was the case. There were other evidence, and it's a little squishy, but of the punishments meted out on the one hand that were also linked to runaways. And again, the Texas evidence is a bit more firm than things that I found in California. But it's worth starting to dig through site by site the San Gabriel mission down here and other missions because many of their records are pretty extensive to sort of figure out this kind of thing. One of my colleagues here is doing some of that work, not because of environmental issues and fire, but because that's part of what she's doing with her students is working through the San Gabriel missions. And she's one of the people who said, you got to read this stuff because there's a hell of a lot of environmental information in here. But thank you for the question, Dewey.
Thanks, Chair. Just a reminder, if anybody has any other questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them chronologically. The next one is from Janice Mendez. One important fact to cultural burns is that they burn the surface for plants to come back and for animals to thrive.
Yep.
The deep burns are the fires that destroy.
Yes. Well put.
Okay, then from Greg Knight, we have burning near cities is a hard sell due to air quality concerns, even though it's very needed. Your thoughts on getting folks to understand the necessity of statewide burns and whether the California Air Resources Board is in agreement?
Yeah, that's going to be a really tough sell. But, one could argue that neither Altadena nor the Palisades might have burned with the ferocity with which they burned at the very beginning of that fire. Once they hit the structures, it was game over. But I was on one of the local television stations, and they cut away from me for a moment to talk with a Forest Service fire manager up in one of the canyons, and they were rapidly clearing away as many acres as they could. This is after the fire, but we were getting another spurt of Santa Ana winds, and they were deeply worried that something else would pop off. And I'm looking at them do this, and they had like 30 or 40 folks in the crew, and they were working their butts off. And the question is like, you knew this stuff was going to happen. Why are we not doing it now? Why are we doing it now as opposed to have done it 3 months earlier? And it's expensive work to be sure, but part of it is making the case financially, making the case environmentally, ecologically, that it is actually this is the only way we're actually going to really get a hold on some of these rapid fires, and particularly those in urban areas. The dilemma here is twofold, one of which is you're right about air quality. That is something that it's like we breathe bad air all the time. I would prefer to have none of that, but we've got it. So part of what we have to get used to is these spurts of fire, small fires that are being managed for a particular end, and we say that end is worth whatever the smog is that I might breathe for that day or two. And the second of which is that it can have an extraordinary impact on the broader sustainability of these communities. If you look at Mammoth Lakes, if you look at down here, Wrightwood and other sort of ski towns up in the mountains, they have started to do some very serious defensive work, in part because they can, in part because they have to. And the thing that strikes me so much is that we have failed to do that kind of work down here, which, given the fires since 2003 in Southern California, you would have thought that any one of them would have precipitated a massive and well-funded effort to do exactly what you're describing, Greg. That hasn't happened, and rather what we do is we build into the fire zones as opposed to pulling ourselves out of it. I'm laughing, but it's terrifying what we have chosen to be what we think of as good policy, when in fact it's the exact opposite.
Thank you, Chair. Next one from Barry McPherson. Were Spanish and other European approaches to fire suppression deeply rooted in practices in Europe?
It's really interesting because if you look at Spanish range management in Spain, they used fire. If you looked at Spanish management of the South Texas range, they used fire. The missionaries didn't want the Indians doing it, but when they ran their own cattle and sheep in South Texas, south of San Antonio, they were using fire to regenerate the grasses. So there is an intellectual connection, a technological, cultural transfer, certainly from Germany and France and elsewhere, where from their vantage point, fire in the woods was a really bad thing. But the Spanish seem a lot more fluid than this. It's a complicated story. And yet from the degree to which Spanish ranchers were using fire to do what they knew they needed to do to create the grasses that they wanted, which is why, for a period of time at least, the range in South Texas was actually prolific because fire was continued as the indigenous people had. It was only later that it was snuffed out, and then we got a landscape that was known as the brush country, which means the grass is gone and all you've got is the scrub brush that had grown up in its place.
Okay, next one from Todd Warner. Were there any dissenting
voices among the
early Spaniards who saw the value of fire for
Not that I
forest
found.
or chaparral health?
Not that I found. The dissenting voices tended to be not Spanish or Mexican, for that matter, when they took over, kicked Spain out, and took over for a short period of time before the Americans come in. It's actually, strangely, often Americans who had been here under Spanish rule and elsewhere, particularly up in the higher ground, at higher elevation in the Sierra and elsewhere, who had a better understanding by the 18th century, by the late 1800s, than did the Spanish or the foresters who would later come in.
And that leads neatly into the next one from Steve Moore. I first learned of prescribed fire in '69 in Sequoia National Park as the principal tool to permit regeneration of sequoia trees, which need mineral soil to germinate. Do you know if indigenous burning existed in the higher elevations?
Yeah, well, yes, we have records from Forest Service folks who they didn't believe their eyes, and they often said it wasn't true. But their observations were, before they thought secondly and thirdly about what they were talking about, they were finding burn scars and sequoias that dated back long before them, well before the mining crews got in there and burned like crazy to open up the face so that they could log more easily. They would later attribute it. I mean, here is some of the stuff that drove me crazy in the book, but totally fascinating. That if you are so convinced that fire is as bad as you say it is, then you've literally got to cook the books. And there's an example of, and in fact, a Forest Service researcher found this, of two of the most vocal foresters in California who were dead set against prescribed burning. They said, okay, we're going to try, see whether we can actually do this thing that everybody says the indigenous people did, and we'll run an experiment. Well, they ran an experiment and said, way too expensive. The fire ran out of control. This is terrible. Well, it turns out, and they brag about it in one of their memoirs, they were putting limbs up against the trees so that when the fire ran lightly over the humus, it hit that, and then it was like a ladder fire going up into the canopy. I mean, literally, they were using science as a way to convince a larger audience that science proved that prescribed burnings was inimical to forests. It's striking to me the degree to which the agency fought against its detractors at ways that were at some point scientific and at sometimes just deeply suspicious.
Okay, the next one is from Dave Carroll. Would you like to address the question he raises in this, Char?
Yes, so population density is relevant to understanding how indigenous folks could adapt to fire by moving and avoid the disasters we've got today. A very big challenge and relevant, yes. So let's be careful about describing indigenous people as moving. In Southern California, there were large population concentrations. In fact, it's one of the most dense populations of any indigenous people, and they were burning like crazy. But they were burning at particular times a year, a calendar that no longer works, as we well understand at this point, when we don't get rain in the winter or very much rain recently. The dilemma isn't their population density or their capacity or the low population density or their capacity to move, because these are settled places. They're not moving. What they're doing is burning in ways and in places that serve their interests, and so will burn up in the foothills and up in the mountains in Southern California, everywhere. But that's not where they lived. They lived inside the valleys, close to riparian systems, many of which are no longer extant. So it seems as if, how could they possibly do it? Because there weren't streams here. For Carrie Livingston, who's on this call, as she may recall from our days at Pitzer College, in the so-called wash area just to our immediate east, there were rivers running through that. All of that's been buried because of flood control, but this was a really vibrant landscape. The same is true up in the Mono Basin as well as in the Owens River Valley. That water has disappeared, that landscape has dried out, and I understand Los Angeles took the water, I got that. But we're looking at land conversion and trying to see ourselves in different ways. The dilemma is, and David, you're absolutely right, there's 20 million people in Southern California. That's a lot of people. Just try driving the freeways. And so we are going to suppress any fire as fast as possible, but you note big fires happen here all the time. And even with aerial, and even with some of the best trained firefighters on the planet, and even with firefighters coming in from Mexico and Quebec and other places to help us, this place burns anyway. And the dilemma for us is that human geography and trying to figure out a way to get them out of the way. And also, as other questioners raised, other questions that were raised, to get some fire back onto the ground. And we can do it in some ways with mechanical means, going in and cutting. That's expensive, but dear God, So was the Palisades fire. So was the Altadena fire. It is striking to me how much money we are willing to pay to fight a fire and to reconstruct it after it has burned a place. But we're not willing to invest proactively. And that's our real fundamental social dilemma.
Thank you, Chair. Again, that leads neatly into the next one from Kevin. Is it possible the USFS supported fire suppression because it created more USFS jobs?
No. No, it's so ideological. And it doesn't create jobs until really the 1950s or so. And that's one of the big pivot moments when all of a sudden we have surplus bulldozers from the war, airplanes from the war, pilots from the war, parachutes from the war, new chainsaws that emerge as a result of the war and the technologies that happen. And all of a sudden you can send out a fleet of people at the same time. And so here's, the 50s are a really interesting point, the 50s through the 80s, the so-called get out the cut process. The way in which the Forest Service paid for its enhanced personnel in the 50s through the 80s is not firefighting, it's through logging, which generated an enormous amount of money because private forestry companies, forest product companies like Weyerhaeuser, they basically ripped their landscape to help fight the war. And the national forests were growing all along. And by the 1950s and 1960s, were ready to be cut again. And boy, did they cut them.
Okay, Char, thank you. Looks like we're running out of questions. Any last chance for any more questions?
These were great questions. Thank you all.
They were. Okay, looks like we're running out. So therefore, Char, thank you very much. We really appreciated you coming, and we look forward to your next book and your next visit to our company.
Excellent. I can't wait. Thank you all so much.